All right, hello, this is Jordan Frazick from AppGeo. We want to once again welcome everybody to another NSGIC co-sponsored webinar, and this one is entitled Closing the NG911 Gap Between PSAPs and the GIS Community. And today you'll find out why it is really more than just adopting data standards. In this webinar discussion, we'll be focusing specifically on education for personnel at PSAPs, GIS, and IT departments at various organizations about the specific types of data that drives NG911, the NENA standards, as well as some other types of initiatives that are going on in the world of public safety and broadband. So we will talk about the origins of these types of campaigns, and within that realm, we'll be showing off some examples of these new methods that can hopefully drum up some ideas that apply to different use cases amongst the audience today. We also want to note that we hold many webinars geared towards many government institutions here at AppGeo. So feel free to head over to appgeo.com/events as well, and you can check out our webinar section. And in this case, we'll be holding another webinar with NSGIC actually in just over a month from now as well. So that's about the pivot to broadband on September 15th. So in that case, you can keep an eye out for Harpenter's email for the next presentation. And in the next slide, without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our host today. So our host today will be Kate Hickey, Vice President at AppGeo. Kate has over 20 years of geospatial experience and a wealth of strategic planning expertise, and next year will actually be Kate's 20th year at AppGeo. Joined by Kate for the webinar and the Q&A session is NENA standards expert Cheryl Benjamin. Cheryl has over 30 years of geospatial experience in addition to having managed the New York State Streets and Addresses program. And next we'll have Bill Johnson, a seasoned mapping, GIS, and data analysis professional with over 35 years of geospatial experience. Many of you also know Bill from his Carpe Geo talks or as the first GIO of New York State. Bill is focused on building relationships with many PSAPs and GIS departments, as well as IT departments and agencies of all different sizes. So Kate, would you like to take it from here?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Jordan. If you want to flip to the next, oh, there we are. Okay, so I just wanted to take a moment to introduce AppGeo. I know we have many friends out there, but for those of you who might not be familiar with us, we are a geospatial IT consulting firm. We were founded in 1991, almost 30 years ago, and we're headquartered in Boston, although last I checked, we actually have staff in 11 states across the country now, so we're getting fairly dispersed. We do all things geospatial. We do data development, we do data transformation, we build complex custom applications, do business system integration, geoanalytics, and of course my favorite, strategic and business plans and return on investment studies. It seems that nearly all of these disciplines are applicable to the world of Next Gen 911, and we've been thinking a lot about how we can serve the NSGIC community. And today's presentation is really an outcome of some of the conversations that we've been having. So if we could go to the next slide. Briefly today, our agenda is in 3 parts. So part 1, we're gonna shut down the slides and I'm gonna be engaging Bill in a conversation about what we see as the biggest problem facing states as they embark on Next Gen 911 implementation and planning. Next, part 2, I'll invite Cheryl Benjamin to share some of her experiences from New York and other states, and really give us some tangible advice from the field here on how to engage the 911 community. And then lastly, Bill and I will explore a few ways that you can set yourself up for success. So, we go to the next slide here. We're going to start with a conversation here. So let's actually turn off the slides, and Bill and I are going to turn on our webcams. And I think Aaron's going to shut that off so we're not distracted by the slides. All right, great. So let's get started with some background information, some assumptions that we can all use that will help set the stage for today's conversation. No, I think we all understand that Next Gen 911 will really be a complete re-architecture of the current 911 system. The old system assumed that a phone was tied to a house and to a business location, that static location. And that was really just a series of database lookup tables, and there was no spatial component there. The new system assumes the phone is mobile and is going to convey its location. It's using GIS for all of its core functions, including identifying that location of the caller, routing the call to the correct PSAP, identifying the appropriate emergency or medical services, and providing that location and context back to the first responder. Today, over 80% of the calls that come into 911 are wireless, and that number is just going to keep rising. So historically, the 911 world, pre-next gen, was completely self-sustained. They had everything they needed within their community. They had their specialized systems, the specialized software, the data, and as part of a public safety organization, they were locked down for security purposes. It's understandable. Now with next gen, the 911 world must engage with people and entities outside of their ecosystem to be successful. But this is really hard, both for those with inside and outside. They reflexively want to protect their data and systems, whereas GIS people, we all reflexively want to share data and systems. It's part of our GIS culture. And what we're hearing from state GIOs, when we attend NSGIC and have those conversations, and when we talk with other GIS program coordinators, is that it's often really, really hard for GIS folks to gain traction with 911 coordinators. So, Bill, I'm going to put you on the spot here. As a former GIO for New York State, what's your perspective? How did you, and now that Frank Winters, I know you guys have talked about this, how did you approach it in New York?
Well, thank you, Kate, and welcome everybody. So, first of all, I think your assessment that there is a gap between the communities is spot on. What we have to recognize if we're GIS professionals is that the world of 911 is very different. It has a different context, different traditions. And I think that gap has several different dimensions. First of all, there's an operational dimension. 911 is operating in the here and now. They're getting calls from people in emergency situations. They have to react quickly under high stress and have to be completely accurate in the information they provide. And that's very different than the typical operating environment for people in the GIS world, where data projects unfold over months or years, and the data is often put out there, even if it's not fully vetted, and with the presumption that it will get better with use, more eyeballs on it, it will eventually clean up. That's really quite opposite of the way things operate in 911. Second, there's an organizational dimension. 911, as you mentioned, is part of public safety. That's an organization that's very hierarchical, very command and control. Those are people that follow orders, follow protocols. They show a lot of respect for the chain of command. You contrast that with a typical IT organization, which is where we generally find GIS these days. There, it's much looser, and I'm saying looser, not loser. It's it's a culture where you're trying to encourage people to do the right things by making it easy. Make it easy for the mice to find the cheese, and really you're counting on them to follow along. And that's really especially true now with IT organizations in most states having been consolidated from smaller IT departments and separate agencies. So now you have a big sprawling IT organization that really consists of a lot of smaller fiefdoms. So it tends to have an organizational structure that isn't very clean, and it can be confusing lines of command and control. And then there's a cultural dimension. In the GIS world, we tend to approach problems with an assumption about open data sharing. We just assume going in that the other people that we're dealing with are willing to share their data, willing to share their methods, their results, and all that. Whereas in 911, the culture is to protect and safeguard information. They tend to have a lot of security protocols, access controls, and the mindset by default is to share only with those with a need to know. And if you go and visit some PSAPs, and I highly recommend you do this if you haven't already, particularly in the rural counties, they tend to be located in the sheriff's office, in the sheriff's public safety building, and everyone in the building is in a uniform, and it's a very structured environment. It feels very, very different than a typical GIS office. And all of this is a long way of saying it's not about right and wrong. It's really, we have to understand both perspectives, and we have to respect both perspectives. And so the challenge is to build trust. And that's a long-term thing. It takes a long time to build that trust, but you work on it and you never give up, and you find those areas that you have in common and you begin to make progress, and that will build up the trust. So it's a long-term journey of discovery.
Mm-hmm. So Bill, can you give us any examples of how this played out in New York?
Yes, I can actually. So, in New York, sadly, we had that horrible event of September 11th, 2001. And so New York was very aggressive and an early adopter of the whole Homeland Security model. And we were the first state to have a Homeland Security agency. And very quickly, a whole bunch of things were assembled into Homeland Security. It included emergency management and emergency communications, which included 911 in the state, and it included cybersecurity and GIS. So our GIS office was moved from the precursor to the state IT agency into this Homeland Security agency, and it was there until 2012 when the state started a major IT consolidation. So I spent more than a decade immersed in a public safety agency, and so I got a front row seat and really learned a lot about how they operate and what the differences are in mindsets.
And as this transition was happening, were there questions or were there issues that arose and presented themselves that around trusting the data?
Yeah, well, trust in the data is really a key thing. And the 911 community operates on a mindset of minimizing the risk. They want data that they can depend on very quickly. They don't want to have to second guess. They don't want to have to go recheck. They're just assuming that everything has been done before that data reaches their hands. So they absolutely have to trust the data to make those kind of life and death calls, that the decisions, those on-the-spot decisions that they're making. And that means right out of the gate, they're going to be hesitant to trust data that they don't know the lineage of, that they didn't have some oversight or some role in the processes that brought that data to bear in their situation. So you start kind of from behind when you approach public safety. And you have to remember that they're seeing you as an outsider. You have to build that trust. It's not going to be handed to you.
And given these challenges around trust and thinking back to this notion that 911 really operated very independently, we as GIS people think that GIS data has to be part of the answer. But do you think that 911 will come to GIS naturally?
No, actually I don't, and there's a good reason for that. Historically, they have enough funding to do things on their own. They don't need to go outside and seek collaborators to get things done. And so this model of assembling everyone who has a hand in the process and bringing those all to bear to solve a problem, that's not the normal way that 911 has historically operated. So, it requires an education effort to help them understand that, to help them understand that the data that they need now in this new world of next gen, it's different data than what they had before, and there's more people involved in the creation of that data and the maintenance of that data. And so there's a whole new community of people that they need to be introduced to, people that they need to come to trust. And this all relates back to the data quality as well. We're just not used to dealing, those of us kind of in the general world of GIS, we're not used to dealing with data that has life and death consequences, that has to be turned around so quickly and has to be so thoroughly vetted. What I think that really means for those of us in GIS is that we really have to up our game. We have to take it up several notches. And that can be hard, but it's really worth it, because in the end, we're all going to have better data, and better data is better for everything. And so it's an opportunity for a real win-win.
And you think that they could proceed, and that there could be states where 911 proceeds and even succeeds without coming to GIS? You think that's a very possible reality?
Yes, sadly, I think we have to acknowledge that they have an independent source of funding. They don't get their funds like state GIS offices do from the state general fund. There are dedicated funding streams to feed Next Gen 911. Generally, in most states, it's from telephone surcharges. And interestingly enough, in this recent pandemic, call volumes have actually increased. So while we look at state budgets and the current budget crisis that a lot of states are facing with their general fund, where revenues from sales tax revenue and income tax revenue are going to be way down as a result of all the hardship from this pandemic, the call volumes that generate surcharges are actually up. So we're talking about an initiative that's going to be solidly funded going forward, and they would be able to proceed without that collaborating. And so we have to approach it by proving the value that we bring and making that a net positive to that community.
Mm-hmm. So, if I'm understanding you correctly, and this gap between the two just represents very different perspectives. And I have to say that, without this mutual understanding, we have to question how can this collaboration be expected? I think many of the GIS folks have assumed that this collaboration will be, everyone will be on board. But, do you have any thoughts of this when you think back to what happened in New York?
Yeah, Cheryl's going to talk in a few minutes about how we actually engaged the 911, the PSAPs, on our initial address project. But actually, I want to tell you about an example that predates that, and that is, in that decade that we were in Homeland Security, we ended up providing a lot of support to the Office of Emergency Management, and they had a single GIS person over there. But whenever there was an activation of the Emergency Operations Center, the EOC, which in New York is one of those Cold War underground bunkers with 3-foot concrete walls, it was designed to withstand a nuclear blast, I suppose. And so you go down there, outside of daylight to support the activations. And we ended up doing quite a bit of that. Every time there was an activation, they would call us up and we would send people from our team over there. And it was very difficult for us to absorb that because these came as interruptions in our regular work. It made it very difficult for us to keep up with the the schedules that we had and the projects that we had going on at the time. And we ended up working out a pretty interesting arrangement. We were able to get approval for 2 additional staff, GIS staff, in our GIS team. They were hired on the basis that they would be the ones immediately deployed to the EOC every time there was an activation. And so these folks were hired knowing that was going to be the case. They actually had go bags, with, their toothbrush and some changes of clothes and that sort of stuff, under their desk. So when the EOC activated, they could immediately deploy. And when there were long activations, we would put other people on our team into the shift rotations that might go for a couple of weeks if it was a really long activation. But at the end of the day, we had a situation where we were able to use those folks in between activations on our projects, and yet we were able to fully support the needs of the EOC whenever there was an activation. So it was a real win-win. And we set this up, it must be close to 15 years ago now. And I talked to Frank Winters last week just to confirm that is in fact still in place. That model is still working very, very well. And it's been really, I think, an exemplary way to meet both of those demands from competing public safety and general GIS needs.
Yeah, interesting. I hope maybe we can hear of a couple other examples if there are other states out there that have examples of this that they could share. It occurs to me in listening to you that one tool for building this shared perspective or understanding is creating a really well-defined data governance model. Not a model that's on the old way of managing data as you described, but one that acknowledges the seriousness. Again, as you described, the life and death nature of this situation and criticality of this data. A data model that recognized the magnitude of the task for the 911 community and sees that, GIS is certainly a critical component, but it's only one piece of the puzzle for 911. From where I sit, states could really benefit from a data governance model that thoughtfully describes the roles and responsibilities, that describes a fair funding approach, that describes and builds that trust, you know, for the ongoing commitments to quality and completeness and security of data. And this model also needs to recognize that the resources and the readiness are never uniform across the state. I think Cheryl's going to tell us a little bit more about her experiences there. You know, that's a lot of moving parts to take into account, and it means the implementation can get really complex, I imagine. You know, Bill, how does this tie into what you did in New York and how Frank is dealing with it there now?
Yeah, so data governance is really, I think, a very interesting topic. You know, we didn't always call it data governance, but the basic model of getting all the stakeholders together, taking these problems and breaking them down into digestible pieces, and then sorting those out, who's going to do what are the roles and responsibilities of that. That's really what data governance is in a nutshell. And that's what state GIS programs are good at. That's what they've been doing for a very long time. What I think is interesting about 911 is that it represents an immediate expansion of the stakeholder pool. We've suddenly got a whole new community to add. And that's the first element we have to deal with. Cheryl's going to talk to us shortly about, you know, how we did that in New York, and there's some interesting things there. But let's just dig in a little bit further on the data governance piece, because it really works on, I think, on multiple levels. First of all, we have to understand that the PSAP staff, that these new people that we're bringing into the fold, they have very specific requirements. Most of them, GIS is new to them. They're never going to be deep, you know, into GIS and GIS power users for the most part. They just need specific things to meet their very specific sets of requirements. So their attention is going to be focused narrowly, much more narrowly than maybe the rest of the group. And I think we also have to look at the fact that there are workflows happening all over local government where that data is touched. Maybe new records are generated, updates are made, and we have to look holistically at those workflows and capture those activities and maybe tune those workflows a little bit to meet the more urgent requirements of Next Gen 911. And then I think, you know, at the high level, there needs to be some strategic agreements between the leaderships of state GIS offices and those leading the state 911 organizations, because that framework is really needed to make all the pieces fit and work together and be properly funded with the available resources that both of those communities can bring to bear. And so, you know, I really see state GIOs as being in a unique position to support this. You know, we're good at data governance. We're good at collaboration and getting stakeholders engaged. And, you know, Nina's already done a ton of work to create some of the technical pieces that we otherwise might struggle on to, you know, to come up with data models and technical standards. So we don't need to do that. Instead, we really need to be focusing on this effort of bringing the parties together and rallying around the cause.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that sustaining this data governance model is really a human endeavor here. You know, if the technical problems have been solved by Nina and by the vendors that are offering software solutions for data scrubbing or data standardization,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the focus shifts to the challenge, that huge challenge of coordinating all the people involved. You know, identifying those new stakeholders, getting everyone to a common level of understanding, getting their buy-in, understanding how those workflows intersect, understanding how the disbursement of funds may need to change. You know, that's a big one. The funding may need to spread to people in various agencies or organizations to support, you know, maybe new roles or responsibilities in this model. You know, it's essential to build this human infrastructure that's going to sustain the investment. And you know, I'm itching to get to Cheryl here and just understand some of the details on how we do that. So how about at this point we transition to part 2 of our presentation here, and let's bring Cheryl into the conversation. Okay, great.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah. So Cheryl, you know, what's your take on how you build this human infrastructure?
Wow, what Bill was just talking about brings back really a lot of memories for me, because I lived through and helped build that bridge between the state GIS office and the New York State 911 community. I literally put thousands of miles on rental cars, driving all over the state, meeting with the county 911 coordinators and their leadership in all the county offices. And as Bill mentioned, we were very aware that we also had to visit those PSAPs. And we did that. We went and met them as well. I didn't get to every PSAP, but I did visit many of them, and they're really quite different. You had the very large command centers, and then you had small two-person centers, and of course, everything in between.
Mm-hmm. And you know, thinking back to your road trip there, like how important was it for you to go to them versus asking them to come to you?
It's very important because it shows that you care, that what they do is important, and you value their time. And this is about them, it's not about you. And it's basically one of the best ways to begin building that baseline trust. And some of those visits were quite memorable, and it just reminded me of one such visit. And this is actually a true story. In the beginning of our outreach activities, one of the smaller PSAPs we visited was located within a county jail. And so to meet the 911 folks, we had to go through security scanning. And of course, I was the only one who set up the security alarm, and I had to be wanded separately, much to my colleagues' amusement. And I was feeling somewhere out there, somebody took a photo, and it's still out there floating around. But you know, getting that invitation. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
Nope, sorry, just chuckling.
Okay. Okay. You know, getting that invitation to visit all these places, that's not easy. And it started by connecting with the 911 leadership at their state 911 conferences. It started by building a relationship and building trust with key people that were the stakeholders at the highest levels in both 911 and GIS.
Yeah, it sounds like a really memorable experience and probably months of your life there, you know, based on what you learned going through this process. What worked and what didn't work? Like if someone came to you today and asked you, how do I do this? You know, what would you say to them? What advice would you give? And Erin, maybe we can advance to the next slide here too.
So
Thanks.
Building the trust, that's an incremental process. And I would tell them to start with finding a champion. Find that person who needs you to succeed in this role because they have a stake in this too. And if you fail, they fail, and they do not want to fail. But finding that next gen 911 champion, it's not going to be easy. And most likely that person's probably going to be on, you know, outside of your normal comfort zone and be outside of the typical GIO network on the other side, somewhere within the public safety community.
Cheryl, can you tell us who's on the slide here?
Oh, yeah, that's Buster or Bernie. He's actually a former NENA president. He is originally from New York State in the Rochester area, and he is shown here winning the William E. Stanton Award, which is the highest award that's presented to NENA champions. That's
great. That's a great photo. So, you know, in thinking about finding this champion, I can imagine if I were if that were my responsibility, I would have a tough time figuring that out, you know, understanding who do I go to first? You know, what if I've never even met this person? Once I identify them, how do I even convince them that, you know, they are that champion, that they need to take on this role?
Yep, GIOs, they're part of a big network, and it's really big. And they may not know directly someone in the 911 community, but they most likely know someone who does. And that person often can provide an introduction to a key public safety stakeholder, such as your 911 director, someone who's a member of the 911 board, or maybe it's the budget director that oversees 911 funding. And as you're working to identify that connection, who's going to get you over there, think about who's going to see that you're going to have a pivotal role, who's going to connect you with those other leaders and potential champions, who's going to be that door opener for you. And so you'll want to start by identifying who are your natural allies. You want to look at someone maybe within your chain of command, your CIO. Perhaps it's elsewhere, someone in the governor's office or other government peers that you've worked with before. These are critical people because they know you, trust you, and they're going to support you in this endeavor. You need to use your network to find that connection to the 911 director or other public safety leader. Those people can help you identify a champion, or maybe they're going to even be that champion.
And what if you go to your network, you seek out that champion and you really can't find that person? What do you do at that point?
Yep, sometimes finding the right person to be that champion, it just doesn't happen. And in that case, you're going to have to broaden your search, and you're going to have to look in some of your less likely places. Those that have some kind of connection are important to the 911 community, though. Sometimes it can be as simple as following the money. You want to identify where those dollars are coming from to support that transition from Next Gen 911 and make them that champion. Right now, we're in unprecedented times where more than ever, every dollar needs to stretch further. And these people are going to want to make sure that the money they're providing is going to be spent wisely and it's going to the right places. So you want to show them how this partnership will make the best use of those dollars, provide efficiencies, and benefit all of public safety, and bonus, even beyond to more of the other governmental agencies. There's also another less likely champion you probably don't think about very often, but they can still be effective, and that's your elected official. You need to give them a story to draw them in that makes them look good to the constituents so they can turn around and say to them, hey, here's what I'm doing for you, the taxpayer. And sometimes it's an elected official's personal experience with 911 that helps them understand why improving 911 is so important. They want to be part of that solution. And I've heard many stories, as I'm sure you have, across the country of a 911 call that did not end well and how it impacted an elected official. And then the elected official then made it part of their platform to help fix the issue so that such a situation would not happen again. But, finding that right person to be your champion, you really have to be listening. Sometimes it's not immediately clear, and it may not be that person that you're trying to get the introduction with, but actually it ends up being the person you've been talking to all along. If that individual who's been opening doors is really showing a lot of interest in what you're doing and increasingly becoming more passionate about your cause, maybe they're the champion.
I can imagine a situation where maybe you identify that person, but the hard part is, why should they care? Why should that person care about this new community that's really outside of their normal sphere? If they have the power to take action here, they're probably pretty busy people.
Oh yeah, and convincing champions, that's going to take some doing, and you're going to constantly be working to build their trust. As Bill mentioned earlier, 911 is independently funded, so they're not necessarily even going to need to pursue this collaboration. So there are critical conversations that you have to have with them to figure out how to bridge that gap, build that trust with them, and explain that, the GIS community doesn't just want to take from 911, that they're contributing to the success of Next Gen 911, that they're going to help make that data better, add value. You're going to have to spike their interest. Tell the story that's going to draw them in to make them want to hear more. How leveraging their existing resources and workflows, that's going to reduce duplication of effort, dollars spent. Basically, you're accomplishing the same thing, but with more people. And having more eyes on the data, that's going to help improve the data's completeness, the content, and the overall accuracy. And that's going to lead to improved response and better decision-making across all governmental entities, because they're all going to be using that same data. You want to talk a little bit to them about this interconnected community and how it's good for the data, good for government, and ultimately saving lives, which is a key thing that really gets their interest. And you want to convince them too that success is definitely in their interest. And GIOs, they're really, really good at bringing people together to solve problems. And that GIS data required in NG911, that's really their specialty. And then tell them about your success story. You need to exude your confidence. Show them how you've done this before, and it was and continues to be successful. If they're sensing your confidence and we can get it done together attitude, they're going to want to be on that success bandwagon with you. Show them that the GIS community wants to contribute and that 911 needs these GIS people to make the whole system sustainable.
That's great. Some very optimistic advice there. Thanks, Aaron. I was just going to ask you to transition to the next slide. And I'm a pragmatist at heart. And what I'm really interested in hearing, Cheryl, is, what are some of those practical steps you can take that casts that net and brings people together, that skill that GIOs have? What are some of the specific things you can do?
Well, to ultimately make this work, you're going to need to start building support across your network and lay a foundation with your peers all across the state to gain their trust and buy-in. And the GIOs can't do this alone. Kate, did you know that it's estimated that more than 90% of government databases contain civic address information? Most everyone with a database is going to need that GIO to succeed. And GIOs, they already have a strong network of peers, all of which, they're stakeholders in this too. And it's in the GIO's best interest to reach out to them early and help them understand the importance of this new relationship they're building with the 911 community, how it's going to impact them, and how they can contribute to its success. So a GIO, basically, they can approach this by recognizing there's 4 main groups of their peers that they're going to end up needing to reach out to.
Great. And can you tell us a little bit about those 4 groups?
Yep. So there's the 4 groups. The first is the technical leaders. So these are the people that need to understand and support the new technology needs of Next Gen 911. And, the GIO can provide briefings that help to explain the technical impact, not just that the new Next Gen system is going to be IP-based, but there may be a need to establish a new data maintenance platform that the state and local contributors can perform data maintenance and QC activities on. That could really have a big impact on their network load and security. Then you have a second group of folks, and those are the state agencies that are actually building and maintaining GIS data already. So these are folks in your real property, your transportation, public works agencies, GIS departments. These are the people who are already involved in data maintenance, and they have something concrete to bring to the table. And the GIO can use their GIS contacts in these organizations to start opening conversations with the agency executives about this new partnership with 911 and the need for their agency to be involved. And those conversations are going to be a little bit interesting because you're going to have to help them understand how their data is used in Next Gen 911 and the positive impacts and the efficiencies that will result by participating in this new maintenance partnership. And we're not talking about just in 911, but in their organization's data. There's going to be a benefit to them. And some of these same discussions that the GIO had with the champion, they're going to have to be held with the leadership here. And they need to help those executives understand what's in it for them and why their people should be involved. So you're going to want to underscore the opportunities, how their data will get improved through these new feedback channels. Talk about, improving the data completeness, the content, and the accuracy, and how that's going to end up leading to improved and better overall decision-making for their organization. Third group, kind of related but a little bit differently, are state agencies who are using GIS data. And this could be other governmental agencies and boards as well. Folks in your environmental, your recreational education departments, health and human services, and other public safety agencies that are outside of 911. Now, these are the people who are using the GIS data in their daily activities, and they're making critical decisions based on the content of that data. Again, the GIO can use their GIS contacts to open the doors of the conversations with the agency executives. And in the discussions, they need to focus on the fact that their data, or what they do day in and day out, needs to be complete, accurate, and up to date. So help them make the connection that their organization's daily use of the GIS data will put more eyes on it. It's going to identify potential gaps or inaccuracies in the data, and they're going to explain how participating just by simply notifying the data owners there's an issue can lead to more complete and accurate data. Thereby, that's going to result in them doing improved data analysis, better decision-making, and more cost-effective use of their funding. And then lastly, that fourth group, those are your regional groups, your associations outside of state government. Those would be like your regional transportation organizations, your state and regional GIS associations, state 911 associations. These are people who often already play a role in bridging the gap between state and local government, and that's key. Now, the GIO they already know someone in these organizations, but even if they don't, someone they've already connected with is in one of these groups, they do. In this group of folks, they may be able to help open doors at the local level, particularly those hard to reach, hard to convince folks who just don't want to move out of their comfort zone. Ask to go to their meeting, share your message. You want to explain what you're trying to do and help them see how they can be an important piece in this larger network. And they're all working together towards the common goal of highly accurate, complete GIS data. And that's going to benefit everyone.
Mm-hmm. So let's say you've successfully engaged these groups, you're working with them. How do you make sure that you're taking full advantage of what each of these groups has to offer?
Well, success breeds success. So you're going to want to align yourself with those who need to succeed in each of these 4 groups. And if you're successful in this new partnership with the 911 community, show these folks how they can also be successful. And so the GIO should be encouraging this new expanded network of peers to take advantage of these national synergies that just seem to develop so that they can also claim success. And now those peers are going to have a bigger stake in this partnership, and they're going to want and actually need this GIO to succeed even more. And as these relationships evolve, they become the GIO's peer level champions and help the GIO to advocate across the state on why this partnership with 911 is so important.
Mm-hmm. So once you have this C-level champion, how do you move toward better engagement with people at the local level?
Well, this is the hardest part. Connecting with the 911 community at the local level can be the most challenging aspect to building the partnership, and it's probably where the GIO is going to find the most pushback. There can be such a mistrust of state government that has nothing to do with the GIO office, but someone or something else happened previously has unfortunately tarnished the image for anyone in state government, not just the GIO. You have those who fear losing some of their funding to the state. They see the state coming, there go their dollars out the door. You have those who don't want to lose control of the data. Everything that they've been doing is right in their little data silo, and they're very comfortable with it that way. And they want to keep everything in that data silo. And of course, you have those that are just afraid of change. And you've heard the old saying, if it isn't broke, let's not fix it. Well, similarly, in 911, you're often going to hear, hey, everything's working currently in my CAD system. If you touch it, it's going to break. Leave it alone. And then lastly, you have those that are just afraid of the unknown, because not knowing what will happen is scary, and people are very comfortable with the status quo. These are very common statements that GIOs are going to face, and it's up to GIO to help them see beyond their fears and sometimes these misguided concerns.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe you ran into this in New York.
Oh, yeah. We had that happen early in the project. The 911 community was very, very leery about working with us. They thought that we were looking to use their funding to build out our statewide address point. We had a hard time convincing them that we were really there to help them. And more importantly, we had federal dollars we were bringing to the table. We weren't asking for money. We were bringing money. Yeah. And we wanted to make sure in this partnership, though, that we would use our grant money efficiently. But to do so, we recognize the value of partnering with the 911 community. And it did take a long time for us to build that trust, and it really was an uphill process. However, we knew that we had finally broken that barrier and built their trust when we went to one of their state meetings, and we did a project update for the coordinators. And we finished, and we were getting our things and collecting them to sit down. And the president stood up, turned around, and a different state agency represented the room. And he pointedly asked him, why can't you be like them and do for us what they're doing? They're helping us. And that was really the tipping point when we knew they were all in, and we took advantage of that momentum and we ran with it.
That's great. That's a great story. And, once you have that trust and that buy-in and people are, vouching for you, they're helping us, what is the next thing that you should focus on? What would you tell others?
So every PSAP is going to need to be on board because Next Gen 911 requires standardized GIS data. So one area for focus needs to be on the PSAPs that aren't yet there, that are not yet on board. And every PSAP is unique, and you have different challenges to face, whether they be financial, technical, human, or even organizational. There is no one solution fits all scenario. So with GIO, they have to listen and they have to understand those unique situations and then be flexible in finding the right solution for each situation. No PSAP should be left out. So the GIO is going to need to seek ways to help overcome those challenges to make it feasible for all of them. You have to think about and understand that urban areas, well, those tend to have their own PSAPs, and they're often well-funded with adequate resources. And they're going to be ahead of the others and often out in front with new technology. So they may not need much help from the GIO, but they certainly can be your local champions. And then on the exact other side are the smaller PSAPs. And they're the ones who often face the most challenges, and they need the most help. And that's when helping to build a local connected community really becomes beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like, understanding these differences between the communities is essential to the process. But, how do you connect them to build, as you call it, that local connected community?
So just like building their network at the state and regional level, a GIO is going to need to extend that network down to the local 911 and GIS communities. So they're going to need to build trust, and they're going to need to bridge that communication gap and bring the local 911 and GIS communities together and up to the same level of knowledge and understanding about NextGen 911. These folks want to know, what is this thing called NextGen 911, and how is GIS data used in it? How is that going to impact them? What are their roles, their responsibilities? Hey, how can I contribute? And can I be part of the solution? So the best way to do that, you're going to have to communicate. And communication is critical, but it can be in a variety of formats, whether it's monthly one-page newsletters, having short webinars, or hopefully going in-person updates to local and regional meetings. The key is to be visible, to build that trust, to be respectful of their time. Communication should be frequent, understandable, and short, focused on key information. Mm-hmm. You want to find also those local success stories, because that's going to be a GIO's local champion and leaders. Put them on a pedestal. Show others how this can be done locally and successfully. And it's these local champions, well, they're going to be able to encourage others that might be struggling or help open doors for the GIO to meet with those that are local key stakeholders. GIOs are really good at building relationships, and they can help locals connect to their peers and help build their own local support system and utilize local relationships that already exist. But the educational aspect, that's really key. Getting everyone to the same level of understanding bridges that gap between the local GIS and 911 communities.
Mm-hmm. And in your experience, what would you say is the best way to approach that educational aspect?
So one of the most effective ways that we found is to have an educational campaign, which is simply just a series of regional technical workshops, and they're meant to educate both 911 and GIS communities about NextGen 911. So we did this in New York State, and when we were promoting our new partnership with the state 911 community, and we were trying to build out our statewide data for NextGen. And last year, I actually did this on a team with AppGeo and GeoCom, where we helped the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania develop their NextGen 911 standards, and then followed that with a very successful regional educational campaign. And I'm also now part of a new team. Actually, it's the same team, and we're doing a very similar project with the state of Wisconsin. And it includes both standards development, followed by that educational campaign. And one of the things I like to say, though, it's important to note, this technical session, it's not a presentation, but it's kind of like, think of it like a set of mini subjects that provides attendees the valuable learning of core concepts that they can then take back with them. So some of the content that you want to make sure that you include is just, what is this NextGen 911 thing? How does that GIS play a role in it? You want to do a technical model of the required GIS model that's needed for NextGen 911. You want to get down into, it seems like the weeds, but how do you parse an address into the new structure? And that's because right now, they're probably only parsing an address and a street name out into 5 fields. It now gets exploded out into 11 fields. That can be scary. Give them something to realize it's not that bad. And then you talk a little bit about QC checks that can be continually done on the data and some best practices for building and maintaining GIS data for NextGen 911. But it's important in those conversations to make sure you're incorporating local examples, or so the discussions will actually draw their interest into what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. It makes me think about some of the logistics, especially given our the current conditions in the world, the current constraints. What do these sessions look like under normal circumstances and perhaps now?
Well, we highly recommend in-person sessions are best, but like you mentioned, these could be a little challenging right now with COVID-19. So you may have to opt for a webinar until your health guidelines allow for in-person sessions. But when you are able to do those in-person sessions, you really want to make it easy for everyone to attend. So spread them across the state in different locations so that if they can't make their closest one, they have some kind of conflict in their schedule, that there's another one not too far away. You really need to encourage them to show up at these. And then in addition to your GIS and 911 stakeholders, This is a great time to invite your champions. Let them see firsthand what they've been supporting. And then you also want to consider creating a recorded webinar of the content, not one big long 5-hour session, but break it down into short 30-minute sessions for those who couldn't attend. There's going to be folks coming on in the future that are new hires. And then the attendees may want to go back and look at a piece of what you covered. So it's a future reference item for them. These educational sessions, they're going to be a great way to bring the local 911 and GIS communities together and up to that common level knowledge about NextGen 911. So during these sessions, really take the opportunity to establish rapport and help build relationships. This may actually be the first time the GIS and 911 folks are even meeting each other. So encourage some active participation, facilitate conversations between the two groups, find their common ground, get them to talk about their experiences and frustrations because they're probably dealing with something very similar. And it's also important to find out who the challenging attendees will be, because these naysayers, they can undermine the progress and create pockets of distrust. So you want to seek them out before the session and listen, learn of their concerns. We actually ran into this in one of our Pennsylvania workshops. We knew of an especially challenging individual that was attending one of the sessions, and we didn't want that person to disrupt the progress we were making. So shortly after they arrived, I was pointed out to who this person was, and I sought them out, sat down with them, talked to them one-on-one, and acknowledged some of their concerns we knew that they were struggling with, asked for some input, chatted about how we could alleviate these concerns. And then what I did during the session, when it was appropriate, I publicly acknowledged the legitimate concerns and how we'd already discussed some ideas to solve the issues and would be able to move forward. This was important because this allowed me to spin the situation in a way that I could handle the messaging during the class. But that person, they still felt good because their concerns were acknowledged publicly. So lastly, always be looking for ways to continually improve the sessions before you move on to the next. Make sure that you're addressing their concerns throughout the session and pay particular attention to body language. You want to make sure your message is coming across correctly and positively.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Cheryl. That's a lot of really valuable advice and information. And, I'm thinking about our audience today, and I can imagine that as a GIO, it might be hard to know where to start, all of these tactics and approaches that you've described. So that's what we wanted to touch on in the last part of our conversation. So I'm going to invite Bill back to join us. And, just in the last year, we've been talking to a number of states at NSGIC and through other channels that feel an urgency to update their strategic plans. Maybe it's that their existing plan is a little stale, or, a lot has changed since then. NextGen 911 is really one of those big things that has changed the landscape dramatically. A strategic plan can be a really good place to start as it addresses some of those core issues that may challenge your NG911 implementation. What are your thoughts on that, Bill?
Well, as a former GIO, I've always considered strategic planning and the GIO as the leader and keeper of that strategic plan. That's really job one for a GIO. So I don't need any convincing on the need to kind of align this whole thing around an overall strategic plan. It's kind of interesting now that I'm on the other side and I'm in the contractor world. We're seeing a lot of RFPs now for next-gen projects, and they're very focused on the technology components and not so much on these human factors that we've talked about. We see RFPs around software solutions and portals to bring the players together in the technical environment and all the work around cleaning up the data for next-gen, but not much focus on all these human factors that are so critical to the overall success. And, I guess it's perfectly natural. NextGen is a highly complex initiative. And so it's no surprise that we see a focus on these technology pieces. But I hope our conversation this afternoon has raised some awareness on these equally important, equally critical human factors. And I want to make one final point here, if you will. We all recognize that GIS is a wonderful tool for doing good and for solving important problems. But I don't think there are hardly any things out there that rise to the same level of importance as 911. 911 is the most important public safety system in the United States. And, you know, we all rely on it in the times when we're most vulnerable. It has to work. It has to be there. We just count on it. And next gen is going through, or 911 is going through this next gen transition. It's the biggest change in the 911 system in its 50-year life. It's not a small upgrade. It's really a completely re-architected system that's built around GIS. And so for those of us working in the GIS world, I don't think there's anything more important in the public sector than applying our knowledge and the skills that we've accumulated over 30 years of how to do collaboration and coordination work in GIS, that applying those to the success of this next gen initiative. And I really see it as a carpe geo opportunity, and I really urge everyone to seize it.
Thank you, Bill, for those final words. We're really interested in hearing what you all think. We're sharing our opinions and thoughts here, but I'm sure there are lots of perspectives here. So I know we have a couple minutes. Maybe we can open it up for some questions. And also, I think our emails will all be up at the end, and we'd love to hear from you after the webinar as well. So Aaron or Jordan, are there any questions that we can address in just the couple of minutes we have left?
Yes, there is. And, you know, there's definitely a lot of different use cases here. So we do have a lot of questions. I just want to let everybody know that we do have quite a long queue. The first question is, wildlife fire management has GIS folks and dispatch folks. Both work with 911 worlds. How can we include these folks to help address trust issues or even improve data quality and accuracy issues?
Yeah, well, I'll go ahead and take a start at that, and Cheryl and Kate, feel free to pipe in. But you know, all of these different dimensions of public safety, whether they're Office of Emergency Management or wildfire protection or whatever it is, they all have a very common set of characteristics. You know, that operational context that we talked about at the beginning here, where very different than the way we approach regular kind of vanilla GIS work. I think if we can make inroads with any one of those communities, we can use that as a building block to work more closely with 911 and OEM and all those elements of public safety that work in a similar way. Cheryl, you have anything to add?
Specifically, I mean, I think this. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I didn't mean to cut you off, Cheryl, but this specifically towards wildland fire management, I think, is the real heart of this question. Just to give a sense, we do have a lot of other different directions for the next few questions that we can make it to.
And maybe for some of these questions, we could even follow up in writing to some of these, because I don't think we'll have time to address all of them.
Yeah, Kate, I wonder if the work you did with CAL FIRE maybe have some relevance here.
Yeah, I think what I'll do, I can reach out to the project team and get back to this particular person here. So
all right, well then we'll move along. I do agree. Okay. We do want to get to the next few, and I do see there's still plenty of people on the line here. The next question is, I think in most states there's a state agency that administers the 911 program that is operated by PSAPs. Assuming the GIO is at an IT agency, do you find it useful or necessary to engage the state public safety agency? And if so, is that something better done as a precursor to engaging with individual PSAPs? I'm thinking about the chain of command paradigm.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm sure the organization differs a bit state by state. In New York, we had these things, or we still do, where these kind of directorates, they're groupings of agencies with similar functions that have, a deputy secretary that reports to the governor that oversees those agencies. So in New York, there's one that oversees all of the public safety entities. And so, the peer-to-peer counterpart there is through the state CIO, which is, the highest level person overseeing GIS and IT. So sometimes that bridge can be assisted through it with a communication from the CIO to their counterpart at the high levels in the organization. In this case, in New York, it would be the Public Safety Directorate.
Excellent. So I'm going to move on to the next question. Your presentation is mostly focused on a state level. Most efforts are at a county local level. Where does this fit into your connecting with peers?
Mm-hmm. Cheryl, do you have thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so this whole presentation, while we talk primarily to GIO, it occurs across all levels. So there's connected communities at the state level, but there's regional and there's local. And we did talk about local connected communities, and we're looking at GIOs helping them to put the keys together. So you have folks in local 911 and local GIS get together. One of the exercises that we did when we were in New York State, and we found it very helpful, is you kind of do a diagramming of where does everyone fit in the process. So you really all need to get together in the same room and talk about who's creating addresses, who's storing addresses, and map out where that information exists, who's creating it, who's sharing it, who's not sharing it, and maybe should be sharing it. And it's amazing how you see the interconnection between all those entities. So while we talked about state level, it can be done down at the county level as well. A county GIS person can reach across the aisle to their county 911 person and strategize and work together to figure out how they can do something similar and start there as kind of a base.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next question. Because 911 is traditionally very independent, do you see PSAPs creating copies of their own required GIS layers that can become disconnected to authoritative local GIS data and even regional data? I can read it one more time. Do you see PSAPs creating copies of their own required GIS layers that become disconnected to authoritative local GIS data and even regional data?
Yeah, and that is exactly the risk that we want to head off and avoid, because that's extremely inefficient. That's duplication and redundancy. And, as a taxpayer, we expect our governments to work better than that, to figure out how to reuse reusable pieces of information. And so that's the whole goal of trying to bridge this divide is so that PSAPs don't, out of not awareness that they can source this data through the GIS community to a very large degree, so that they don't embark on that kind of redundancy.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so next question, how can GIOs pay for the activities to build the financial support for individual PSAP attention and educational sessions?
That's a tough one. And there's not going to be a single answer that fits every situation. We actually got kind of lucky in New York to get our address project started. We actually had a federal grant that we won that was actually associated with broadband mapping, and we had made the case that there was an additional pot of money available under the broadband program to improve the mapping to address level. And we made the case that in order to do that, we had to have accurate address points. And so we were able to get enough funding out of that to kind of get the ball rolling for the program. And once it's rolling, it kind of gets taken over by the operating budget of the GIS office for long-term maintenance activities. So, it started with some seed federal money and then evolved into, state general fund money. But again, this is not a one size fits all solution. It's always look for the opportunities, what resources can you leverage and bring together?
I've actually seen some states that are using some of the funds that they have in, and they're setting up their own state funded grants for the localities to actually bring their data up to NextGen 911 standards. In order to get paid, they actually have to get it into the format that's needed at the state 911 level.
Awesome. And we are down to the last two questions in our queue, but we will stay here as long as it takes to answer any additional questions. So feel free to ask any more questions within your questions box and go to webinar. The next question is that Bill hit the nail on the head about data sharing. Since our state, ESI net is statewide. Since our state is since our state is ESI net statewide, we have some of the only statewide GIS layers available. But several counties and PSAPs didn't want to share, even though all data was non-sensitive.
Yeah.
So
your
that is
question?
actually the question. Sorry.
Well, that's
So
okay.
I'm
You don't want
assuming the question
to,
is why, maybe it's perhaps like, why didn't they want to share even though it wasn't sensitive data, or what are some of the, things that surround sensitive and non-sensitive data?
Yeah, and that's a very tough one. And we had some jurisdictions in New York that it took a long time to get them to finally to flip over. And there's a couple of kind of interesting dimensions to that. One is that with these kind of initiatives, early on, you're kind of building some consensus. You get the early adopters, and you eventually reach this place. I call it the tipping point, where you've kind of crested the hill, and the ones that are left start to look over their shoulder and say, "Geez, so my neighbors are already on board here." It makes their reluctance look a little bit out of place. And but you still get to these last few that just have, they've dug in. They may fervently believe that it's inappropriate to share and whatever. And in some cases, you really just have to wait them out. You have to wait for a retirement, or a change of leadership in the county, or something else that without a change of some change in the circumstances, they're just probably not going to come on board. And that's the reality. So you get as many as you can, and you never give up.
And that's
Cheryl,
true. You don't ever give up. Yeah, you don't give up. It's going to meet them. Go sit on their turf. Sit down with them. Find out what their concerns are. See if you can work around it. We had that in a couple of our counties. You do the map of green. Here's all the wonderful counties that are participating with us, and here's the ones who aren't. And all of a sudden, you have one left, and you put red coloring on it and be a bullseye, and boy, did that get their attention. But then, we had another one that they were very concerned legitimately about, well, this is going to contain address data. You're making it publicly accessible. My constituents don't want to see that. And how do I know we're not going to get sued because you're going to use our data as input to create these things? And so you have to sit down and look with them and understand what their concerns are, and then point out, okay, you have this concern, but in this agreement that we're asking you to sign, we no longer have any of that available to you to be sued about, because we state in here in our agreement that no one can sue you for that we're creating something separate, and it doesn't trace back in order to be able to put them in any legal issues. And we had all kinds of local legal lawyers look at it and make sure that just because the state lawyers said it was good, we wanted the local lawyers to confirm. So we had several of the counties preview it before we even put it out. Again, it's all about communicating.
All right, so we're going to move on to the next question here. Do you include the actual emergency responders in meetings and getting them involved in the process? They are the ones who are trying to find out the location of an emergency and would be the greatest champions. As part of the question.
Yeah, sure. Why don't you take that one?
Yep. When we started having some of our initial meetings, we wanted to make sure that all the right people were there. And sometimes the 911 folks would just send the director himself because he was still getting used to who we were. But when we started doing educational sessions, we told them, if you've got people who are going to be using this data, feel free to invite them to it. Let them understand how this technology is being used. Just like a lot of times what the PSAPs do is they have their law enforcement officers come and spend a day in the PSAP so they understand what's happening on the other side of that mic. When they're on the end that's responding, they have to understand what's happening on the front end. And so this is another way to tell them that just like when you go and spend a couple hours in the 911 center to learn about the call side, you need to understand about the data side on the back. We had several of the counties that actually, when we were doing our data build and QC, and then we delivered data, we pointed out some things that needed research. They loaded up their officers with that information, sent them out in the field to go field check those addresses for them. Great use of making them understand the value of the data. And a lot of that's because that data is existing in their police cars. They have now systems online that are actually hitting on that street and address data so they can do accident location analysis.
All right, and I will move on to the current last question. Indoor mapping is currently becoming a hot topic. Do you think there will be a next gen 911, so another next gen 911, because of the advancement in technology and public expectations? Should we be going further for unit-based addressing?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, this is something that the FCC has some rules and orders out regarding vertical accuracy. It's been a hot topic over the last year. There's been a lot of conversations across the country. And NENA right now, the National Emergency Numbering Association, has stood up a special work group just to deal with vertical accuracy. If that's something folks are interested in, they could go to nena.org and look into it. But it is to get to the level of if someone dials 911, will the responder be knocking on the correct door within that facility?
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions that have come in, and I do hope that everybody has enjoyed this webinar, and I hope you'll join us for the next NSGIC sponsored webinar on the 15th of September. And with that, I'll leave it to our presenters to see us off for today.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, especially for sticking around a few extra minutes as we went through the questions. So much appreciated.